The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge as Rosalind Zimmerman clutched the crumpled letter in her trembling hands. It was 1878, and her father's death had left her with a homestead drowning in debt and a proposal she never wanted. "You should be grateful, Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife, had told her just yesterday, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "My husband says Mr. Thornton is willing to take your father's land and you along with it. A woman alone has no business running a cattle operation." Rosalind crumpled the letter tighter, her knuckles white. Edgar Thornton was nearly 30 years her senior, a man who'd been trying to absorb her father's land into his growing empire for years. Now that Benjamin Zimmerman was dead, he apparently thought acquiring his 22-year-old daughter was part of the bargain. "Miss Zimmerman," a deep voice called, breaking through her thoughts. She turned to see Ranger Porter, the tall cowboy who'd recently taken the position as the town's lawman. His broad shoulders and steady gaze had been a fixture in town for only 3 months, but he'd already earned respect from most folks in Copper Ridge. "Mr. Porter," she acknowledged, hastily wiping a tear from her cheek. "Is everything all right, madam?" he asked, concern evident in his blue eyes. Those eyes were his most striking feature, standing out against his sun-darkened skin and beneath the brim of his well-worn hat. "Just fine," she lied, tucking the letter into her pocket. "Just some business with the bank." "I heard about your father," he said softly. "My condolences." "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "If you'll excuse me." Rosalind hurried toward the general store, aware of the whispers following her. Everyone in town knew her predicament. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she should do, and most of those opinions involved accepting Edgar Thornton's proposal. Inside the store, Ruby Wilson greeted her with a sympathetic smile. "Good morning, Rosalind. What can I get for you today?" "Just some coffee and flour," she replied, setting her basket on the counter. While Ruby gathered the items, the bell above the door jingled, and Edgar Thornton himself strode in, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden floor. He was a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes that had never looked at Rosalind with anything resembling affection. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, removing his hat. "Just the person I wanted to see." Rosalind stiffened. "Mr. Thornton." "I trust you've considered my proposal," he said, his voice carrying through the store. "I've spoken with the bank. They're willing to hold off on foreclosing if you accept my offer." Ruby suddenly found something to do in the back room, leaving Rosalind alone with Thornton and his 2 ranch hands who flanked him like obedient dogs. "I received your letter this morning," Rosalind replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need time to consider." "Time is something you don't have much of, my dear," Thornton said with a condescending smile. "The bank will take action next week if the debt isn't settled." "I'm aware of my situation," she said, lifting her chin. Thornton stepped closer. "I'm offering you a way out. You should be grateful, girl. There aren't many men willing to take on a woman with nothing but debts to her name." The store door opened again, and Ranger Porter stepped in, his presence immediately filling the small space. His eyes took in the scene, narrowing slightly at Thornton's proximity to Rosalind. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Just having a private conversation with my future wife," Thornton said smoothly. "I haven't agreed to anything," Rosalind shot back. "But you will," Thornton replied confidently. "You have no choice. Either way, that land will be mine." Ranger Porter moved between them. "Seems to me the lady hasn't made up her mind, Thornton. Why don't you give her the space to do so?" Thornton's expression hardened. "This isn't your concern, Ranger. Peace and order in this town is my concern," Porter replied evenly. "And right now, you're disturbing both." For a tense moment, the men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Thornton replaced his hat. "Think about it, Miss Zimmerman," he said. "You won't get a better offer." After Thornton and his men left, Ranger Porter turned to Rosalind. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. "No offense, madam, but you don't look fine." His voice was gentle. Ruby emerged from the back room looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Rosalind, that man gives me the shivers." Rosalind managed a weak smile. "It's all right, Ruby, may I have my items now? I should be getting back to the ranch." After paying for her purchases, Rosalind stepped outside to find Ranger Porter waiting beside her wagon. "Let me help you home," he offered. "That's not necessary, I insist," he said, already taking her basket. "It's on my way." It wasn't on his way, and they both knew it, but Rosalind was too tired to argue. As they rode in silence, the mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. "You know," Ranger Porter finally said, "there are other options besides marrying Thornton." "Are there?" she asked bitterly. "The bank wants their money in a week. The cattle need tending, the fences need mending, and I have exactly $3.42 to my name." "You could sell some cattle. In a week. Even if I could round them up, which I can't do alone, the price would be too low this time of year," he nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "What about hiring help? With what money?" They crested a hill, and the Zimmerman ranch came into view. It wasn't large by Western standards, but it was good land with access to water, the reason Thornton wanted it so badly. "It's a fine piece of land," Porter remarked. "It was my mother's family's land," Rosalind said softly. "She died when I was 10, but I remember how much she loved this place. My father worked himself to death trying to keep it." As they approached the house, Porter suddenly reined in the horses. "Someone's there," he said, his hand moving to his pistol. Rosalind squinted and then relaxed. "It's just Hank. He worked for my father." The old cowhand was sitting on the porch whittling a piece of wood. He stood as they approached, nodding at Rosalind and eyeing Ranger Porter suspiciously. "Miss Rosa," he greeted. "Ranger. Hank, what brings you by?" She asked, climbing down from the wagon. "Heard about Thornton," the old man said bluntly. "Came to tell you I'll help however I can. Can't pay me, but I don't need money, just a place to sleep and meals." Tears sprang to Rosalind's eyes. "Hank, your pa was good to me," he said simply. "Least I can do." "One man isn't enough to save this place," Porter said, earning a glare from Hank. "It's a start," Rosalind countered. "Thank you, Hank. There's a bunk in the barn with your name on it." After Hank took himself off to the barn, Porter helped Rosalind carry her purchases into the modest ranch house. "One man isn't enough," he repeated. "But what if you had more help?" Rosalind set down her basket. "What are you suggesting, Ranger Porter?" "First, I'm suggesting you call me Riley," he said with a small smile. "Second, I'm suggesting that I know a few good men who owe me favors." "Why would you help me?" she asked, genuinely confused. Riley Porter removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair. "Because no woman should be forced to marry a man she doesn't want. Even if it means losing everything else, she'll choose her own path," he said firmly. "That's what my mother taught me before she died. And my father respected that, even when it would have been easier for her to do what others expected." Rosalind studied him for a long moment. "You're a strange lawman, Ranger Porter." "Riley," he corrected again. "Riley," she conceded. "And I'm Rosalind, or Rosa as Hank calls me." "Rosa," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "I'll be back tomorrow with help. In the meantime, lock your doors tonight. I wouldn't put it past Thornton to try to pressure you further." After he left, Rosalind stood on the porch watching the dust settle from his horse's hooves, wondering if she'd just been offered salvation or false hope. True to his word, Riley returned the next morning with 3 men. A young Mexican vaquero named Miguel, a former Buffalo soldier named Isaiah, and a grizzled prospector called Doc who claimed to have been a cattle driver in his younger days. "These men will work for room and board for a week," Riley explained. "After that, they get a share of whatever we can make by selling some cattle." Rosalind questioned. Riley's smile was almost shy. "I have some vacation time coming. Figured I might spend it helping a neighbor." For the next 5 days, they worked from dawn until dusk. Hank knew where the cattle were likely to be grazing in the high meadows, and with the others' help, they managed to round up nearly 100 head. Fences were mended, the barn roof patched, and a broken wagon wheel replaced. On the 6th day, as Rosalind was preparing breakfast, a rider approached. She recognized Marcus Holden, the banker's son. "Miss Zimmerman," he called, looking uncomfortable. "My father sent me to remind you that the payment is due tomorrow." "Thank you for the reminder," she said politely. "Please tell your father I'll be in town tomorrow with my decision." Marcus hesitated. "Miss Zimmerman, my father. He's already drawn up the foreclosure papers. He and Mr. Thornton have an understanding." Riley emerged from the barn, his presence causing Marcus to shift nervously in his saddle. "An understanding?" Riley asked. "Sounds like your father might be exceeding his authority, Holden." "I'm just delivering a message," Marcus protested. "Then deliver this one back," Riley said. "Miss Zimmerman will be in town tomorrow with cattle to sell. Any understanding that interferes with fair business will be of interest to the federal marshal." After Marcus rode away, Rosalind turned to Riley. "That was a bluff. We don't have enough cattle to pay off the loan." "No," Riley agreed. "But we have enough to make a significant payment and negotiate terms for the rest." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Rosalind found herself studying Riley's profile. Over the past week, she'd come to appreciate not just his strength and leadership but his quiet humor and unfailing kindness. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked suddenly. Riley was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "When I first came to Copper Ridge, I was just passing through," he said. "Taking the ranger job was temporary, but then I saw you." "Me?" she asked, startled. "You were arguing with Thornton in front of the general store," he recalled. "He was trying to buy a parcel of your land and you refused. You stood your ground even though everyone was watching. I thought, there's a woman who knows her own mind." Rosalind remembered that day. It had been shortly after her father's health had begun to fail. "I didn't know you were watching." "I couldn't look away," he admitted. "I decided to stay in Copper Ridge that day to take the job they'd offered me. I wanted to know the woman who wasn't afraid to stand up to the most powerful man in the county." His candor left her speechless. They sat in companionable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. "What will you do if we manage to save the ranch?" he finally asked. "Run it," she said without hesitation. "My father taught me everything he knew. With some help at first, I can make it work." Riley nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. "Good." The next morning, they drove the cattle toward town, a slow-moving, dusty procession that attracted attention as they approached. Word had spread quickly, and by the time they reached the cattle pens near the railroad, a small crowd had gathered, including Edgar Thornton and banker Holden. "This is a waste of time," Thornton announced loudly. "There's no buyer for these cattle." "Actually, there is," came a voice from the crowd. A man in a tailored suit stepped forward. "Carson Murphy, Murphy Meat Packing Company. I'm always in the market for good stock." Riley caught Rosalind's eye and winked. Later she would learn that Murphy was a friend from Riley's days as a Texas Ranger, summoned by telegram 3 days earlier. As Murphy inspected the cattle, Thornton grew increasingly agitated. "This is absurd, Holden. You said the foreclosure was guaranteed." "Keep your voice down," the banker hissed, but it was too late. Several townspeople had heard, including the mayor. "What's this about a guaranteed foreclosure?" Mayor Wilson demanded. "Holden, you know that's not how banking works." While the argument escalated, Murphy approached Rosalind with his offer. It was enough to pay half the loan immediately, with a contract for more cattle in the fall that would cover the remainder. "Do we have a deal, Miss Zimmerman?" he asked. "We do," she said firmly, extending her hand. As they shook on it, Thornton stormed over. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "Holden won't accept partial payment. According to banking regulations, he has to if it's accompanied by a solid plan for the remainder," Riley countered. "And Miss Zimmerman has exactly that." "You'll regret interfering, Ranger," Thornton threatened. "Is that a threat against an officer of the law?" Riley asked mildly, Thornton's face flushed with anger. He turned to Rosalind. You think you've won, but you haven't. No woman can run a ranch alone. You'll fail, and when you do, I'll still be here. She's not alone, Riley said, and she'll choose her own path without your interference. After Thornton stalked away, Rosalind completed her business with the bank. As expected, Holden was forced to accept the payment and revised terms when faced with witnesses and the threat of legal scrutiny. As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, the tension of the past week finally lifted. The men were in high spirits, especially after Riley had paid them each a small bonus from his own pocket. What will you do now? Rosalind asked Riley as they fell back a bit from the others. Go back to being the town ranger, I suppose, he said. Although I've enjoyed playing cowboy this past week. You're good at it, she observed. Better than I would have expected from a lawman, Riley chuckled. I grew up on a ranch near San Antonio. Being a ranger came later after the war. You could always. She began, then faltered. Could always what? Nothing, she said quickly. It's just that Hank's getting older. He can't do the heavy work much longer. I'll need a foreman eventually. Riley reined his horse to a stop, causing Rosalind to do the same. The others continued ahead, giving them privacy. Are you offering me a job, Miss Zimmerman? He asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe, she said, suddenly feeling bold. Or maybe I'm offering you something else. And what would that be? A partnership, she said, if you were interested in such a thing. Riley studied her face, his expression serious but his eyes warm. I think I'd be very interested in such a thing, Rosa, but I'd want to be clear about what kind of partnership we're discussing. Her heart pounded in her chest. The kind that might start with a courtship and lead to more. His smile spread slowly, transforming his face. I'd like that very much. He leaned across from his horse and took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. May I call on you properly then? Sunday dinner, perhaps? Yes, she said, a happiness she hadn't felt in months, maybe years, bubbling up inside her. I'd like that. As summer turned to fall, Riley became a frequent visitor to the Zimmerman ranch. True to his word, Murphy returned to purchase more cattle, and with his help, Rosalind established connections with other buyers. The loan was paid in full before winter set in. Riley continued his duties as ranger but spent every free moment at the ranch. Together, they repaired the house, expanded the corral, and hired 2 permanent hands to help with the growing herd. By Christmas, their courtship was the talk of the town. Mrs. Holloway, who had once told Rosalind to be grateful for Thornton's proposal, now claimed she'd always thought Riley Porter was the better match. On a crisp February morning in 1879, Riley took Rosalind on a ride to the highest point of her property, where the view stretched all the way to the distant mountains. I brought you here for a reason, he said as they dismounted. This is where I first realized I was falling in love with you. Rosalind's breath caught. When was that? Remember when we were mending the north fence? You climbed up that ridge to spot a stray calf, he recalled. The sun was setting behind you, and you had dirt on your face and determination in your eyes. I thought, that's the woman I want to spend my life with. Riley, she whispered, unable to say more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. I know it hasn't been that long, but when something's right, it's right. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a single small diamond. Rosalind Zimmerman, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes, she managed. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her close, his kiss as warm as the sun on their faces. Their wedding in April was a town affair, with even Edgar Thornton grudgingly attending. He had finally accepted that the Zimmerman ranch, now the Porter ranch, was out of his reach, especially after Riley had exposed some of his less-than-legal business dealings to the federal marshal. Riley resigned his position as ranger to work the ranch full-time with Rosalind. Together, they built a thriving operation that became known throughout the territory for its fair dealings and quality stock. 2 years later, As they sat on the same porch where they had watched the sunset during that pivotal week, Rosalind took Riley's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Are you saying?" he asked, his eyes wide. "Yes," she confirmed with a smile. "Come autumn, there will be 3 of us on this porch." Riley's whoop of joy echoed across the valley, sending a flock of birds scattering from a nearby tree. He lifted her carefully, spinning her around before setting her gently back on her feet. "I love you, Rosa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied. "Thank you for believing I could choose my own path." "I never doubted it for a second," he said. "From the moment I saw you stand up to Thornton, I knew you were a woman who would forge her own way." As the years passed, the Porter Ranch prospered. Their daughter Emma was joined by twin boys, James and Benjamin, named for both their grandfathers. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family, and their reputation grew along with their herd. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Rosalind would find Riley on the porch, looking out over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "Any regrets?" She would ask, settling beside him, and always his answer was the same: "Not a single one." In the spring of 1888, 10 years after that fateful week when Riley had helped save her ranch, they hosted a celebration. Friends from near and far gathered to mark a decade of the Porters' marriage and the ranch's success. Among the guests was Murphy, now a wealthy businessman with meat-packing operations in 3 states. As he raised his glass in a toast, he smiled at the couple. "To Riley and Rosa Porter," he said. "A decade ago, I received a telegram from an old friend asking for a favor. Little did I know I was helping to write one of the greatest love stories in the territory." As the guests cheered, Riley pulled Rosalind close and whispered in her ear, "He's not wrong, you know. Ours is quite a story." "And we're still writing it," she replied, thinking of the land that had been in her mother's family, now thriving under their care, and someday to be passed to their children. Later that night, as they walked hand in hand under a sky full of stars, Rosalind thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, desperate, alone, facing the loss of everything she loved. She thought about the voices that had told her to be grateful for Thornton's offer to accept her fate. And then she thought about the man beside her, who had looked at that same woman and seen not desperation but determination, not weakness but strength. "They said I should be grateful for his hand," she said softly. Riley smiled, remembering. "And I said you'd choose your own." "The best choice I ever made," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him under the vast western sky, on the land that had brought them together, in the life they had built with their own hands and hearts.